My name is Maria Barova, Clean Health Master Coach and WBFF Pro. Today we have Dr. Layne Norton and Dr. Bill Campbell joining us today, and we're going to be diving headfirst into the science of physique coaching. If you guys have any questions while you're watching, you can drop them in the chat and I will try to bring them in. But without further ado, because we have a lot to talk about today, let's kick off this webinar masterclass with introduction. So Layne, would you like to do us the honors and introduce yourself? And then Bill, you can do the same as well.
Layne Norton, PhD in Nutritional Sciences. I've been coaching people for 15 years plus at every level of physique competition, at even non-competitors. We have a team of coaches now. We've created a nutrition coaching app. We've done it all. And then I personally have also competed and achieved a pro card status in natural bodybuilding as well as powerlifting. So that's the short of my background.
The very brief history of Layne Norton, ladies and gentlemen. Bill?
Yes, so I'm a professor of exercise science at the University of South Florida, where I direct the Performance and Physique Enhancement Laboratory. I got my PhD in exercise, nutrition, and preventive health, and my research focuses on physique enhancement, which is basically dieting, resistance training to optimize one's physique, and we approach that within a lifestyle perspective. My competitive background is one bodybuilding show, and I have brought, I think it was 4, maybe 5 competitors to the stage. So a lot of what I learned came from Dr. Norton. So he's the person that I go to ask prep questions. So do not have his expertise with coaching athletes, but I come about this a little bit more from the evidence-based side in terms of the research that I hope a lot of physique athletes rely on as they do their contest preparation.
And I, as a physique athlete myself, who is going into a show this weekend, am all hands on, on deck with physique competitions, whether it's, off seasons, improvement seasons, peak weeks, all of that. So hands on as an athlete and as a coach. So I can't wait to dive into our conversation today. If you guys don't already, make sure you follow Layne Norton, BioLayne on Instagram, and Bill Campbell's Instagram, Bill Campbell, Bill, can you repeat what your Instagram handle is to
Yes.
so everyone can have that? Yeah.
Yep. It's pretty simple, Bill Campbell, PhD.
There you go. And if you guys want to find even more information, you can follow all of us for not only evidence-based physique coaching information, but endless more evidence-based information. So without further ado, let's dive right on in. So we're going to kick off the masterclass by talking about what you think the first step would be to have a coach be qualified to be coaching physique athletes.
And I'm going to ask Dr. Norton, since you have the professional background, if you would always take the lead, and I'll just fill in as with my experience as well.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I think the ideal is that you have education with experience. Now, one of the problems is you can't get experience without experience, right? So at some point you have to try and do. I will say I think it's very helpful for a coach to have actually competed in physique competition. Is it absolutely critically necessary? No, but I think that it's very hard to have a good handle on some of the, quite frankly, the psychological side of things if you've never done it yourself. It's kind of like a general not having been in combat at any point in time and directing troops. You could do it. It could be done, but you may not understand some of the ramifications of your decisions on a larger scale if you only have kind of the quote-unquote book knowledge. Now, that being said, a lot of people coach who have no educational background, and have I seen people become good coaches without an educational background? Yes, but with the caveat that the good ones really try to further their education. So, pardon me. I always encourage people, going to a university and actually getting degree is obviously like great because you can be in a lab, you can do actual research, you get a broader understanding of things, and quite frankly, you get to understand things at a very basic level. And kind of the way I describe it is, it's kind of like when people say, well, why am I doing calculus? I'm never going to need calculus in my day-to-day life. And it's kind of like, okay, yeah, I get that, but if you don't understand calculus or math, then you don't understand physics, and if you don't understand physics, you don't really understand the universe. If you don't understand, science in general, so it's kind of like I kind of compare things to, getting the end product of like actually learning about nutrition and exercise science studies or practical application. That is kind of like if you're looking at a house, that's the windows and the paint and the doors and all the stuff you see. But what do they always check during a home inspection? They expect the foundation to make sure that the house is solid, because the house doesn't stand without a good foundation, and that good foundation is your basic education. So again, I'm not trying to sit on an ivory tower and tell people you need to be a pro competitor and you also need to have a PhD. I don't think that's a reasonable expectation, and quite frankly, I don't think you need that either. But you do need to have the willingness to be a lifelong learner, and quite frankly, that's why I've created some of the short courses that we have on clean health, and why Bill and I are working on something much larger that we'll hopefully be announcing here very soon.
Bill, anything to add to that?
No, I like what Layne said to start off. The ideal is
Yeah.
somebody with competitive experience and education, formal education in nutrition and exercise. That would be the ideal.
Yeah, and
And I would add to that, if I look at like American football, you don't have to play football to be a great coach. You don't have to be a race car driver manager to be a good manager of a race car team. But there's really no other sport like physique sports where
yeah,
you can do everything except for step on stage to get that experience. So a coach who doesn't have a competitive background can still diet to the level where they could step on stage. And I think what that creates is a level of empathy for
yeah,
clients that they'd be working with that they
yeah,
would never otherwise understand or appreciate.
yeah,
So at a minimum, go ahead and go through what your athletes are doing, even if you yourself don't want to step on the stage.
yeah.
Although
I
I
also
will,
do think it.
I
Oh,
apologize, Maria.
go ahead.
I will say though, if they go through all that effort to get that lean, they're going to want to get on stage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. I was gonna say, to add on to that, I do also think it's important as a coach, or if you're listening just because you're curious about competing as well, to be mindful of the coaches you are hiring. There are a lot of coaches in the industry that actually do compete and then think that qualifies them to copy and paste what they did with another client or with their clients, right? So just it's about being an educated consumer and an educated coach as well, because you don't want to be diving into something as extreme as a comp prep with someone who potentially could be putting your health at risk or doing things that are unnecessary or unhealthy or unsustainable. Um, and that kind of goes into the next question of, all right, you are a qualified PT, you're taking on physique athletes, you have someone inquiring about joining and doing a show. What would you say are like the first steps of assessing that client and knowing if they are ready to either dive into a prep? How do you structure that conversation and approach in general?
That's a great question, Maria, and I think you actually really caveated it well with, are they even ready to, right?
Yeah,
Because I've had so many people come to me and I'll look at what they want to do, the show they want to do, and where they're at currently, and I'm going, yeah, we need to talk about like doing this in like 6 months to a year. So,
yeah. It's
and
that building that foundation before diving into the actual prep itself.
right. And I think one of the things that really needs to be clear, one of the first things that need to be established is, what are the expectations for both the client and the expectations for the coach? Because that's going to
Yeah,
form the crux of the relationship. Now, you could, as a coach, you could have a client where you say, wow, if I could get them here, I would be really thrilled, right? But then if the
Yeah.
client's expectations are, well, I'm going to be here, and you could have met your expectations and be totally happy, and they're ticked off, right? So as a coach, I think one of the biggest things is, okay, what is this person's expectations? And I'll give an actual real life example from this. I had a client. This would have been 13 years ago, probably. And this gentleman was in his late 50s. He'd been training for over 15 years. He had been competing as well, and he wanted to add 15 pounds of muscle in a year. And the first thing I said was, I don't think that's a reasonable expectation. Here's how long you've been training. If you want to stay drug free, I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I would be very happy to get like a couple pounds of lean mass on you in a year.
Yeah.
And, further to the point, he said, well, I only have, 60 minutes, 5 days a week to train. And I said, well, then I don't think that this is going to be, something where you're going to be able to build much mass, because quite frankly,
Yeah.
after you've gotten to this point, like, we have to increase the dosage in terms of progressive overload. And at a certain point, that has to be more volume. And if you, if you don't have the time, that's fine. But then the expectation just isn't reasonable. At which point he decided that he didn't want to work with me anymore, because I didn't tell him what he wanted to hear.
And unfortunately, the best coaches do exactly that, is be real. And unfortunately, if you lose the client because you're being authentic and being, following your ethics and morals in a coach and just straight up saying the truth, it's better to be dropped as a coach for that reason and that reason alone. I did want to ask a question to that is, what is the science behind, what is the actual reality of muscle gain within a year? What are the ranges that are expected for natural athletes? And we'll talk about natural athletes until later on in the masterclass. So what are valid expectations that you can provide for your clients?
Yeah, so it really depends on, I think the major determinant, there's two major determinants. The first one is genetics. There are people who respond way better to resistance training than others. It's part of the game. And the second one is, what's your training age? And when I say training age, I mean, how long have you been training with intensity consistently, right? Because somebody could have been training for 10 years, but then they've taken 2 years off, and it's like, well, then that 10 years doesn't really matter. What it means is they're going to gain muscle pretty quickly when they come back. So the longer you've been training consistently, the more difficult it's going to be to gain lean mass. It's just, it's like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube. When it's full, you start squeezing and it comes right out. And then by the time you get to the end, you have to put in a disproportionate amount of effort just to get a little bit of toothpaste. And that is very much what trying to gain muscle is like once you've been training for a while. I mean, people ask me all the time, they're like, well, how much lean mass do you want to gain, Layne? I'm like, well, I've been training consistently for 23 years. So if I put on 2 ounces this year, I'd be very happy. To just being completely honest. So
I think sometimes people forget that, you don't just go to the gym a few weeks and then become bulky. I've been trying to be bulky since I started too. And unfortunately, after hours and hours and thousands of workouts and thousands of meals, I'm not bulky yet. I'm like centimeter by centimeter each year. We're growing and growing, but it takes time. And sometimes that for a client that may be approaching you guys to, do a competition, saying like, hey, maybe this year is not the year to compete, may be like a downer because they don't, have to build a sufficient amount of muscle before doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as a natural athlete, if you are somebody who does not have the requisite amount of muscle mass to, again, it depends on the expectations and the client, right? So if the client says, I just want to have this experience of getting this lean, if I place top 5 or top 10 or whatever it is, then that's great. But if somebody has the expectation of, I want to win, I want to become a pro, I want to go to the highest level, then again, if we're talking about a drug-free athlete, you had best spend way more time at maintenance or a surplus than you do in a deficit, because it is not a reasonable expectation to think that you are going to put on significant amounts of muscle mass while you're dieting all the time. And unfortunately, a lot of people, and I feel comfortable in saying, especially women, tend to get into this phase of just doing a show. They gain a little bit of body fat back, don't like the way that feels, and so they put another show on their radar to do that, and then they're stuck in this phase, and actually they end up just, a lot of them end up looking worse and worse over time. And then if you look at the people who actually make improvements, my wife's a great example. She had done well in physique competition, but she took some time off, added significant amounts of lean mass, and came back and looked way different. And that's how she got to the point where she placed number 2 in the world in Pro Fitness Diva in the WBFF. So
yes,
I think a lot of women just aren't, and a lot of men too, aren't willing to, kind of be a little bit uncomfortable in terms of body fat. And quite frankly, I'm not saying you have to gain excessive amounts of body fat, but the literature is pretty clear that it's very difficult to maximize the amount of muscle you're going to build if you're not in an energy surplus. And it doesn't have to be a huge surplus.
That literature about, what is the rate of a surplus in body fat that's needed to be gained in order to, optimize muscle building. We can dive into that conversation. I think it's really important, like you said, spending a sufficient amount of time in those build seasons. So how would you set that up, navigate that, and what is like the optimal body fat range, right? You don't want to go one whole end or be too preserved where you're like, oh, well, I need to cut again.
So I'm glad
what are your recommendations for both?
Yeah, and I want to get Bill's perspective on this, but I'm glad you brought this up because this is actually a module of the content that Bill and I wrote. I'll go ahead and put it out there. It's called Physique Coaching Academy, that's going to be coming hopefully sometime this year, and if not, definitely next year, which is going to be basically if you are interested in changing people's body composition or coaching people for competition, this is going to be the certification you want. It's massive.
So excited for that one.
So one of the modules we talk about is, why not just recomposition, right? Because the studies show you can lose fat and gain lean mass at the same time. So why not just do that? Well, the problem is while you can do it, in people who are well trained, it's not a large amount of increase in muscle or loss of body fat. It's pretty nominal changes. Yeah. And so sure, you can do it, but guess what? You're not doing either one to the best that you can. And so you're much better off taking defined periods of time and focusing on each. Now, to your point about like what's the optimal range of body fat, that's a very difficult question to answer, and I don't think there's really any studies out there that were equipped enough to answer that question. What I will say is I think it's probably somewhat individually dependent. And I think the reason is if we look at the literature on a body fat settling point and body fat set point, your body has kind of a native range of body fat that it kind of tends to default to. And I think you don't have to go like well above that, but I do think you need to be kind of in that settling point range in order to make really good progress. And because if you're below it, your body, regardless of even in a slight surplus, if your fat mass is lower than your body is used to, then the overall signal is going to be, we need to eat more, we're in an energy deficit, those sorts of things. So my best guess is, for most people, that's somewhere around, 10 to 15% body fat if you're a male and probably 15 to 20% body fat if you're a female. But there are certainly people who are outliers. We've all seen people who can stay very, very lean and even as drug-free athletes can put on significant amounts of muscle mass, and we all hate those people. And then some of us have to put on a little bit of body fat in order to be able to do that. So again, not saying you can't stay lean and gain muscle mass. What I'm saying is you probably can't stay consistently leaner than what your body tends to default to and add as much muscle mass as you possibly could. And as far as the rate goes, Maria, I'd have to dig back through some of the literature, but I do know in untrained people, we've seen about the maximum rate of amino acid deposition in muscle in mechanistic studies about 5 to 10 grams. And if we extrapolate that out for like a year, and again, this is assuming like their rate of progression doesn't slow down. If we extrapolate that out for a year, and we account for the fluid that's associated with the protein that's being built, you end up at about like 10 to 12 kilos of lean mass over the course of a year is about what we estimate you could maximally add. And that's for somebody who's completely untrained. So you can imagine that after, even a few months, let alone a few years, that's going to fall off quite a bit. But again, I'm interested to get Bill's perspective because he may know some of this literature a little bit better than I do.
I'll just say the literature on weight gain, particularly for physique purposes, is almost non-existent. That we have, for every 30 studies in fat loss in lean people, which I don't even think there are 30 studies in that whole world, there's so much less in the opposite direction of like lean mass gain or mass gaining. You asked the question that's been asked of me a lot lately, and I think this came up over the last 2 years about identifying your current body fat percentage and then making decisions on gaining from there.
Yeah.
I don't know where that came from. I know it's popular now, but to some extent, I don't know if it's a relevant question. What's your goal? Chase that goal.
Yeah. I think, trying to do things at once is, and from my experience as an athlete as well, for up until when I went pro last year, that's exactly what I was doing. And it was to the point where I just think, the good thing that came out of COVID was a forced build season that taught me from now on that when a coach says build, it's time to build, it's time to commit fully to a build. And it's the heaviest that I got. But it wasn't just heaviest in the sense of like I allowed myself to not train properly with progressive overload, eat sufficient amount of protein, which I want us to dive into that as well. But I really did allow myself to eat in a surplus consistently and maximize the progress I was able to make, which completely changed my physique when I decided to compete again once the world opened up. And I think, especially like Layne, you said this, women and your female clients may be a lot more hesitant to do that. It's truly just about being transparent as a coach, and you got to be that support system during that build time because especially with your female clients, it gets hard. It gets really hard. So to follow with that question of when you are setting up a build, right, for your client, let's talk a little bit, one, about training optimally and how to ensure that you're not just gaining excessive amounts of body fat and not making progress with your lean muscle mass. And then we can talk about the nutrition components of that as well. So let's talk about the training aspect of it first. How can you optimize training to ensure you're making some sort of progress with building lean muscle mass?
I'll lead with this. I don't like to change much about the training program, regardless of the phase. I have the philosophy, you're always trying to train to build muscle.
Yeah.
Now that may be trying to prevent a loss of muscle when your nutrition is working against you in terms of a caloric deficit. But I don't think I can't justify large changes in training based on a mass gaining phase or a caloric deficit or contest preparation phase. So those things revolve around, number one, intensity. Take each set to near failure. You don't have to go to complete failure. Take it to near failure. Then you have your intensity established. Secondly, experiment with volume. Where are you at with your volume today? And then slowly over time, you have to be careful because some people following an internet program can get their volume way, like a snowball, way out of hand very quickly with increasing volume. So that's where I stand. It's progressive overload, emphasizing intensity, and not much of my approach is that your training shouldn't change. Your cardio changes, your nutrition changes, your training. It should be I should not be able to look at your training, in my opinion, and identify, oh, this is where you're at in your phase of your nutrition right now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think, go ahead.
Oh no, I completely agree with Bill. This is something, I've changed my mind on many things over the years, but I'm steadfastly in this camp that, this idea that you need to change your training program because you're going on prep. And the two basic changes that I typically hear proposed are, well, you should switch to higher reps, so you can burn more fat. And it's like, if you look at the differences and actually we write about this in our modules in PCA. If you look at the differences in calories burned between different rep schemes, it's basically no difference when the sets are equated. It just doesn't seem to matter. So there's that, and then people also.
Sorry for that. There's like a lag, and I'm like, oh, I don't hear anybody. Okay, go.
Yeah, wonders of the internet. So there's that, and then the other proposal is, well, we should back off the training volume because you're not going to recover as well. So I actually think that there's a little bit more merit to this. However, we have to think about, that's kind of like the up close version. If we take a more like broad or the 10,000 foot view of progressive overload, we have to understand that what are you telling your body? Well, you're telling your body that when you're in energy deficit, calories are scarce, and also now we're having less load, less requirement for adaptation placed upon the muscle. So what you're really saying is, this energetically expensive tissue you have, well, you probably don't need as much of that because it's not being stressed as much. So I'm with Bill. I don't think training should necessarily change. I don't think reps should change. I don't think sets should necessarily change. I think it should be, the goal should be progressive overload throughout the entire course of a training program, including fat loss. At a certain point, you're not going to gain muscle, or most likely not going to gain muscle during a fat loss phase, but hopefully you'll maintain muscle better. Whatever builds muscle best will likely maintain it best. And the only change I would say that might need to happen near the end of a contest prep is just changing exercise selection. Because things like free bar squats and deadlifts and some of these big compound movements might become a lot more difficult just in terms of balance. I just know like how I felt. There's different ways to stress a muscle without necessarily doing some of those movements that might, one, have a greater recovery impact, and two, you just don't feel as secure executing. So I think exercise selection changes would be the only thing that I might change based on the phase that somebody's in.
I would add to this too, the perspective of you looking at a resistance training program as part of the fat loss equation is a fundamental flaw in contest prep. Your fat loss is from your diet and your cardio. Your resistance training is the only anabolic stimulus that you have in your corner during a contest prep. So use that and maximize its anabolic stimulus for what it is. Do not turn it into another bout of aerobic activity with higher reps. Now, again, higher reps, there's a place for them. But if you're viewing your resistance training as a stimulus for fat loss, that is a fundamental flaw of your perspective.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think, it's again, from my experience this year I've been training back to back with shows. That was the key of like really utilizing my training to maintain the muscle that I have worked so hard to build, given that I'm on deficit after deficit after deficit with back-to-back shows. And, it's not just going into the gym and trying to burn as many calories. It's being super smart with my training so that I'm utilizing the energy that I do have to really, really maintain. I'm not trying to really grow right now, but truly just to maintain my muscle mass. And one of the questions that, ties in from one of our listeners right now is, when you are in a build phase, in a surplus, and we talked about, nutrition being the driving force for fat loss during, a cut or a prep. When it comes to being in a surplus, how long do you actually need to be in a surplus to make a significant amount of change?
So again, we actually have a module on this. Now, if you look in the research literature, there's no studies that are going to be able to tell you this. They just simply do not exist. What I can say is that a build phase of less than 12 weeks is probably not worthwhile. You're just, especially
Yeah.
if somebody is, then, and you might as well extend that. The more trained somebody is, the longer you can extend that. Now, you can do nonlinear sort of dieting like I used to do, where I do like 8 weeks in a surplus and 2 weeks in a deficit and that sort of thing. But over the course of those 10 week block, I was overall in a surplus, right? So you can do
Yeah.
things like that. I don't usually do it with most clients just because people end up, again, it's like chasing rabbits a lot of times. What I tend to do
Yeah.
now is I'll just really slowly increase calories over time. If somebody starts getting really uncomfortable with their body fat, we may do a shortcut in order to just let them feel a little bit more comfortable and then continue the build phase. And what tends to happen really interestingly is if somebody just stays at a certain level of body fat, they might be uncomfortable with it at first. And again, like I don't let any of my clients get to the point where it's like, oh, whoa, what happened to you, right? And if you're, quite frankly, if you're in a controlled calorie surplus, like a small surplus, like a 10% surplus, that's just not going to happen, because what's going to happen before you'd ever gain the amount of body fat that would put you in a holy crap, like what happened to you sort of situation, is your
Yeah.
total daily energy expenditure is going to adjust to that anyway. Anybody who's ever tried to do, there's a few people out there that say, well, I'm going to do an ultra lean gaining phase. I'm just going to add 100 calories on top of my maintenance, and I'll just, I'll gain like a half kilo or a pound a month, right? Well, what
Yeah.
happens? Well, either you gain absolutely nothing or you gain a little bit and then you gain nothing, right? Like you tend to
Yeah.
teeter out pretty quickly. So again, that's just not going to happen by accident. What tends to happen and where people really go wrong during building phases is they get frustrated with the fact that the scale doesn't move, or it doesn't move, and then they boom, gain a kilo or 2 pounds. That's very normal, by the
Yeah.
way. That's just how things go. Fat loss is the same way.
Yep.
And so people tend to just get frustrated and just go, wow, I'm so frustrated with this. I'm just gonna, get big, eat big, get big. And, they figure, I guess, well, I'm going to try and condense a year-long gaining phase into about 16 weeks, And so they gain a
Yeah.
bunch of excess body fat, and then they say, oh, see, bulking doesn't work. And it's like, no, bulking
Yeah.
the way you did it doesn't work because you weren't patient. And that's,
Yeah.
honestly, I think the best trait that a competitor can have is, quite frankly, patience. And a lot of people don't have that. And my absolute best clients and the clients that have done the best consistently are those who do not get hung up on one day or 1 week. They look at the overall picture and they act according to that.
Yeah. And I think having a coach and being that coach for your athletes is, being realistic, regardless whether what the goal is. I think this is a rule of thumb for all coaches. You have to lay out the groundwork. This is your goal. Well, these are all of the actions and habits you need to actually do to get to that goal. If you can't commit to them and you can't do them, it might be worth reconsidering that goal, right? Or at least reconsidering, your actual efforts are going to directly reflect the amount of change you want to see. So it's not that the program isn't working. It's simply, like you said, you're not doing the work. And I think sometimes it's that you're working with humans, not robots, where you have to really stress that, especially when the discomfort starts to kick in. And one of the questions we had also being asked is, is there one Cher Follett asked, if I've been told that I cannot build muscle at my age, I can only accent what I have. I'm so confused by this. Is there a sort of limit of like, okay, this is as much as you can build. This is what you're stuck with. This is what you're going to look like. We're just going to have to work with what you got. Is that true?
So I'll take this first and I'll let Bill go.
Yeah.
There's different caveats to this question, but in general, there's no age at which you cannot build muscle. There was a study at the University of Illinois, like right across the street from where I did my PhD, where they took frail elderly, like people who couldn't hardly even stand up, and
Yeah.
they basically started them squatting down to a very high chair. And then over the course of 12 weeks, they progressively lowered it, and they were actually able to add some weight in some cases. And they showed that these frail elderly people were able to add significant amounts of lean body mass. So this idea that you can't build muscle after a certain age is completely bogus. Now,
Yeah.
if you start at age 50, can you build as much as somebody who started at age 20? Maybe not, but you can still build significant amounts of muscle. Now, if you're 50 and you've been training for 25 years, yeah, you might not be able to build any more muscle. But if you're somebody who is at a low training age and you've just started later in life, you can probably build as a percentage of your starting lean mass. The research data seems to suggest that you can build about as much as someone else. Now, somebody starting at age 50 probably has less overall lean mass than somebody starting at age 25 or 20, so they might not be able to build as much in terms of the absolute number, but as a percentage of their starting lean mass, it seems to suggest they can build about as much.
Yeah. Bill, you have anything to add? Oh,
Yeah, yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. The person didn't give their age, but they made the comment, I've been told I can't build muscle at this age.
yeah.
I'm getting to that age, unfortunately, and I'm not. The literature would suggest it's harder to build muscle the older you get. So something that nobody appreciates is it's a shift in perspective. But if you're maintaining what you have, that's a win. Because when you get into your 50s, 60s, 70s, the normal life span approach is losing muscle mass. So I have to challenge myself. If I don't lose muscle as I get older, that's a win.
Yeah.
But like Layne said, there is evidence that you can gain muscle, with the caveat if you've been training your entire life and now you're 64. I would suggest it's going to be difficult for you with a training history, a training life of 20, 30 years. You're going to be looking at grams and ounces in your success. And again, with the perspective, if you just don't lose muscle, you're actually winning. And that's a hard for a competitive person or somebody that's a resistance training mindset, because you're always like, I love resistance training people. Every day there's a goal. Every workout is an accomplishment. I mean, I love that mindset. That's what makes the world better. I love, if you can't tell, I just love people who lift weights. They're tough people. And to try to tell them, yeah, you just got to maintain. That is a hard pill to swallow, but it is true.
Yeah. And, I think sometimes whether it's, on the flip side of that, training with younger athletes, understanding that it takes time to build and it takes time to grow into that physique. I did my very first show at 19, and I was looking at competitors who have been training for maybe 8 to 10 years. And I was like, well, why don't I look like that? Telling my coach, what's going on? Your program isn't working, and that was before I knew that, you have to stay true to the course. And I just, did my check-in this morning, and I said, I am so proud of myself for loving resistance training as much as Bill Campbell, because year after year, I've added little by little, and now I'm starting to really see that I'm developing that physique that I've wanted to have when I first started, and that there's always room for progress and improvement, or like you said, even just maintaining it, being able to be like, wow, I put in all this work and I want to maintain all those years and workouts of, blood, sweat, and tears type of thing to build what I built. So on the flip side of that, maintaining, building, resistance training, we all love it. That's why we're here talking what we're talking about.
Maria, I'd like to add.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'd like to add one thing to that, and I think it just some people really need to understand this. Fat loss takes patience. Fat loss is easy. Fat loss is quick reward compared to gaining muscle. And I think I have a very good perspective on this. When I got started, I did my first show when I was 19, and I'd been training consistently for about a year. And my legs were not very good. In fact, when I posted pictures on different bodybuilding message boards, I got called chicken legs. They were like, "Do you even train those? Those are pathetic." Yeah, exactly. I had people say, you're a disgrace to bodybuilding because my upper body was big, my legs were small. And, I was kind of like, well, I started like many teenagers. I didn't start out training legs. I started out training chest and arms and then gradually worked my way around the rest of my body. But I figured, once
Yeah.
I started training legs hard, they'd respond like the rest of my body. No. They were very, very, very slow to respond. And I've actually I put up a picture comparison. After 3.5 years of training my legs hard, they still were not very good at all. And I made a commitment to myself that I was going to train hard for 10 years. A lot of people that say, well, you gain most of your muscle in the first few years. And so it'd been so easy for me to say, yep, I'm just not cut out for this bodybuilding thing. I'm going to trash it and go on to something else. But I
Yeah.
stayed committed because I knew what I wanted. And I trained hard. And I also made a commitment that I was going to squat 500 pounds for reps because, in my exact words were, there may be somebody who has small legs who squatted 500 pounds for reps, but I haven't met him yet. So I'm going to squat 500 pounds for reps. So I did that. And before my first pro show, which was in 2010, and that was 9 years after my first show, so I had been training my legs hard for 10 years at that point. I was practicing my posing in front of one of the federation judges, and I was commenting about like the way I hit a certain pose. I said, well, I know my legs are a weak point, so I do. And they stopped me and said, your legs aren't a weak point. And I was like, what? And I had in my mind, well, this is who I am. I just have bad legs, but I didn't anymore.
Yeah.
As I always say, it's funny how when
Yeah.
you work really hard consistently for 10 years, how stuff tends to work itself out. So what I will say is, I think a lot of people, one, they don't want to put the work in unless they're guaranteed the outcome. And here's the rub.
Yes.
You have to put the work in and be guaranteed absolutely no outcome. But if you don't put the
Yep.
work in for a long period of time, I promise you won't get it. So if
Yeah.
you want to build an impressive physique as a drug-free athlete, you better be willing to commit to years, if not decades, of very, very hard, consistent work and not diet all the time. I'll add one more thing. So
Yep.
I competed at 19, I competed at age 20, at age 22, age 26, and then age 30. So I basically, between I started taking longer and longer breaks, and that's when I started to see jumps in my physique, especially when I took 2 years off between 2002 2004. Did that, then I took another 2 years off from 2004 to 2006, so another jump, and then I took 4 years off after I won my pro card before my first pro show, and in 2010, that's where I had that physique that I had finally been seeking, but it took me, over a decade to get it.
Yeah. Patience is the long game. And I think, one of the things as, an athlete and what I tell my clients, because I do have some clients that are going to be competing as well, is you truly have to love the work it takes to be a champion before you become a champion, because you're going to lose. And, technically, I always tell myself you win or learn. So every time that I don't get the outcome I want, the first thing I do, and I'm that way as an athlete, I text my coach, yeah, I did great. What's next? Like, what do I need to do? What do I need to improve? Give me the work, because I know I have work left to be done. And you truly have to be passionate about that, because like you said, yeah, a few people can go in and on their first run get it right. They're done. They're genetically blessed, luck, whatever. Fine. But that's a small percentage of the population. Most of us, if not almost all of us, have to put in the work for long periods of time. And so your clients or yourself could be really frustrated with that. You got to fall in love with the game. If you want to play it for a long time. If not, you're going to burn out and say, yep, this is not for me, which is fine too, right? And one of the questions I wanted to touch on is when we're talking about, knowing when to, the work that needs to be put in to be a champion, work to be a competitive athlete. You have a client coming to you, and how do you assess if that client is ready to dive into a prep when it comes to like the muscle mass? How do you determine if they have enough? And deciding which division they will fit best in. That's one of the follow-up questions. Deciding the division and then knowing if they want to do another one or commit, like how much muscle do they actually need, especially if they're not really lean. You can't really see the true muscle mass, right, by just looking at them.
So I think again, this is the goal to win the first show they do, or is the goal to just
Yeah.
get on stage and do well and feel comfortable? Because it's a
Yeah.
very different answer depending on what that expectation is. And again,
Yeah.
I think it's really important for people to understand, even if the goal is to win and the coach believes you're in a position to win, bodybuilding or physique competition in general is like golf. You could shoot your best round ever, but if somebody else shoots a better round that day, you're not going to
Yeah.
win, and that's just the way the cookie
Yeah.
crumbles.
Yeah.
So I think the part of it is just you have an eye for it over time, even when somebody's in the off
Yeah.
season. Like the more you
Yeah.
work with clients, the more you kind of understand what it looks like under the surface when you see pictures of somebody.
Yeah.
So I think, and if somebody's not like really, out of shape, usually you can tell pretty well
Yeah.
whether or not they're going to have the goods or not. I think as far as which category they fit best into, usually I'll start with, what is your ideal category? What would you like to go into? Where would you like to be
Yeah.
at? And depending on that, it will, again, like if somebody says, well, I love figure or fitness diva or, one of the more muscular classes. Well, great. But, if their muscle mass isn't there at that time, it's going to be, well, if you want to do well, we need to put in some time working on this.
Yeah.
And I think this is more difficult now, and I think the reason for that has a lot to do with social media, because there is this pressure to look really impressively lean year round,
Yeah.
because that's how a lot of physique competitors create their content and build a following. Back when I was
Yeah.
doing it, it was like, okay, nobody's going to know anyway. So if I'm an ogre in
Well,
the off season, it's not a big deal. Um,
yeah.
so I think it is more difficult now, but again, it's one of those things where you kind of have to decide, what's more important, what I want right now or what I want most. And I always tell people, don't sacrifice what you want most for what you want right now.
Yeah.
So if somebody doesn't have a preference, then a lot of it is just, well, let's not make a decision right now. Let's start dieting you down. If we think they have enough muscle mass for at least say bikini, or in the case of men,
Yeah.
men's physique, let's start dieting you down now. And you know what? It's easier to be more muscular and leaner than the category you're in, and just pose down to that category in terms of like
Yeah.
just don't display the muscularity as much. It's a hell of a lot harder to pose
Yeah.
yourself into a category where you should be more muscular and leaner, right?
Yeah.
So I will tell people, let's just start you dieting, and as we get a better indication of where you're at muscle wise, then we can choose the category we think you're going to fit best in.
Yeah, and it's also looking at the federation that they want to compete in. Each federation has different looks that they're going for and different criteria. So as a coach, it's really important to become really well educated on each of those federations, or if you have a niche of which federation you're going to be coaching in, and staying up to date, because a lot of the stuff changes all the time based off of the new standard that's set by those champions and things like that. So at the end of the day, you can assess, okay, what do you want to do? Like, for example, I one day want to do wellness because I just love the training of training really heavy and strong legs, and I don't ever want to be told like don't build your legs anymore. But that's going to take time. For me, in the meantime, bikini it is, right? And I love the division. I love training for it. But with like that muscle maturity, muscle age, and time that I'm putting in, my legs might catch up to me and be like, oh, well, we got to switch you over, right? And that's something that as a coach, your clients will be trusting you with, but also understanding that reaching out to the federations too and try to getting an insight on these things, talking to other coaches and judges, and using those resources, because it's kind of your body picks your category for you, whether you like it or not, as a competitor at least. um, when it comes to you figured out what category they're going in, and let's say once they start getting leaner, you see that potentially that they are not at that category yet, how do you navigate, do you encourage entering those clients in several categories? How do you navigate that with the client?
That depends on the organization. Some organizations don't allow those crossovers, but if they do,
Gotcha.
then absolutely you can do those crossovers and then see what the judges say. I mean, they're going to kind of tell you,
Yeah.
where they think you belong based on how things go. And getting
Yeah.
feedback from the judges, that's a huge thing as well. And even, if you have a judge in your area, meet with them. If you have a national judge in
Yeah.
your area, meet with them, because getting that feedback is really, really helpful. And
Yeah.
also, it's and I'm not saying that this is anything to do with like anything nefarious, but it's great if the first time a judge sees you isn't at your show. It's great if they've seen you
Yeah.
before that, and that's just human
Yeah.
nature. Like if somebody like already knows you, even if like
Yeah.
consciously they're not they may not be like putting you at a higher ranking consciously, but if you stand out in
Yeah.
their mind, that's always an advantage. So I
Yeah.
think that once again, if they're not sure, I usually like if let's say that the organization doesn't allow crossovers. If the hardest are people that are in betweeners, you know.
Yeah.
So like in the IFBB, my wife would have been kind of an in betweener. She was too small for figure, a little bit too muscular for bikini. So in that
Yeah.
case, if you want to do well, especially in non-tested organizations, for her, it'd be much easier for her to just downsize.
Yeah.
And that's not that difficult. You just stop training so hard
Yeah.
in certain areas, and you'll start to lose muscle mass. That's pretty easy for your body to
Yeah.
do. But if somebody's dead set on a category, I'm usually not going to try to talk them out of it if they're super passionate about that category, as long as they understand,
Yeah.
hey, you may not place as well here as you might in another category.
Yeah. And when it comes to like certain categories, is it necessary to take performing enhancing drugs to be successful and competitive in federations in certain categories? And to follow up with that, is there a way to calculate your client's true growth potential so that you could be real with them where it's like, hey, potentially you can't take your body to that unless you do go that route?
Yeah, so I never like to paint with a broad brush.
Yeah.
However, I would say, female bodybuilding has kind of gone the way of the dodo bird. There are, I think, still a few shows left. So in untested female bodybuilding, if you want to be a pro bodybuilder, I mean, for the most part, you're going to have to take steroids.
Yeah.
Female in the women's physique in the IFBB, the vast majority, if not all, are using PEDs and probably good amounts of PEDs.
Yeah.
And even in the figure category these days, there's quite a bit of performance enhancing drug use. Now, I'm not saying that somebody has to take PEDs. I
Yeah.
think there are probably some figure pros who get there who are not taking them.
Yeah.
But I would say that there are quite a few who are. As for
Yeah.
bikini, I personally have coached many women to pro level bikini with no performance enhancing drugs, no illegal drugs. Now, again, these are IFBB categories. Now,
Yeah.
are there women in bikini who are taking performance enhancing drugs? Absolutely, no question. Do I think it's needed? It depends on the genetic potential of the individual. And you asked, like, how do you calculate that? Well, it's difficult to calculate, but if you work with somebody for a few years, you're probably going to get a decent idea of what their potential is like,
Yeah.
just based on the rate of adaptation and the rate that they put on lean mass. So unfortunately, it's really hard to give black and white answers to this stuff. In the men's categories, again, if we're going by
Yeah.
IFBB, men's bodybuilding, with maybe very, very rare exceptions, you're not going to qualify as a pro bodybuilder without drugs.
Yeah.
Now, men's physique, probably very similar. Classic bodybuilding, probably very similar. Am I saying that every single one of them is on performance enhancing drugs? No, I am not. I'm sure there are some who are not. But when we're talking about the creme de la creme, the top people, the vast majority are going to be on quite a bit of performance enhancing drugs. WBFF, you know, again, I would say that there's probably less overall drug usage in that organization, but it is untested, and I have no doubt that there's a large amount of people who also use performance enhancing drugs. And I think that that's, you know, if somebody's worried about that, I would encourage them to compete in drug tested organizations if that's your primary
Yeah.
concern. If you are choosing to compete in a non tested organization and you're choosing to be drug free, what you're saying is, I am at a disadvantage, but I understand that and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And then don't complain if you don't do as well because you chose to compete in an untested
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah. And can you guys touch on the differences between coaching a natural athlete and an athlete that is enhanced? I know it's sometimes a tricky situation when you are a coach, especially a coach who's been coaching for years and has experience with that. When you are encountering the difference between both, what are realistic expectations in regards to training and nutrition for both?
Yep.
Uh,
My coaching history was all natural competitors, and so I don't have a lot to add here. So I'm curious what Layne would say, but my outlook is that it's two different populations.
Yeah, agreed.
so I actually have a little bit of a different perspective. I think that you can't train them exactly that you can't coach them exactly the same way, um, because on an absolute level, enhanced competitors have more lean mass. They are going to have greater levels of energy expenditure. Some of the drugs increase energy expenditure, so they're likely going to be able to consume a greater quantity of food. They may be able to tolerate more training volume. However, the principles do not change, in my opinion,
Yeah.
which is progressive overload. But progressive overload is relative in terms of there is some evidence that suggests that when they look at research studies, one of the big drawbacks on research studies is that if they put people in like a high volume or a low volume category, and let's say high volume was 20 sets per muscle group, and the low volume category was 10 sets per muscle group. The problem with that is you'll have people in the high volume category who might have actually gone down in set number. They might have been doing 30 sets per muscle group before that. And you'll have people in the low volume group who might have been even lower than that before that. And so there's actually a couple studies, and Bill talks about this in his module in the course. There are a few studies where they've looked at, well, what happens if we just look at the people who increased or decreased their relative training volume to when they started the study? And when you look at that information, what you tend to see pretty consistently is almost across the board, there's better outcomes when people increase their volume relative to what they started with. Hopefully I'm phrasing that correctly, Bill. And then the other common thing is, well, people on performance enhancing drugs, they need more protein. And the idea is, well, they're building so much muscle that they need all this extra substrate. Well, I think we all would agree that, like, even on performance enhancing drugs, building, say, 20 kilos of lean mass in a year is a massive amount of lean mass. Well, that like boils down to like an extra 30 grams of protein per day. So if you're worried about it,
Yeah.
just eat enough to maximize protein synthesis, which is like around 2.2 or 2.4 grams per kilogram, and then just add 30 grams of protein on top of it. Like you don't need to maximize muscle gain, you don't need like 400 or 500 grams of protein. It's just it's dogma. It's not what's necessary.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you can't. People say, well, look at all these pro bodybuilders who eat all this protein. So, yeah, that's just what they've been told to do because that's, but the research indicates that you don't need to eat that much. Now, can you gain muscle? Absolutely. Do you need to?
Yeah.
No.
Probably not. Yeah. And when it comes to like the expectations for a rate of change, right? You have an athlete that is natural and an athlete that is enhanced. What would you say are general differences in the rate of change from like maybe like one competition season to another? So that, when you are faced with more so talking to like natural athletes, to be real with them in the sense of like, you have to understand that this person's before and after is matched. The reason it's the way it is potentially because they are enhanced, and you need to be realistic with your, obviously stay in your own lane, but like focusing that you are not doing that and you are natural, and it's not realistic to compare to someone who potentially is enhanced and refuses to say anything about it.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
I don't know if you guys heard my. Okay, go ahead.
no, I heard it. So I think I'll take this
Yeah,
first, and then I'll get Bill's perspective. Um,
perfect.
so there was a study by Bazin done a while back, and it was really interesting. They took people who resistance trained, and they either had them resistance train, or sorry, no training, no drugs, training only, drugs only, training plus drugs. And of course, training plus drugs was the best outcome. But drugs and no training actually produced more lean mass than training and no drugs. So you're absolutely right. When you're talking about like performance enhancing drugs, you just have to understand that those changes are going to take place more rapidly. And that's also why people will say, well, look at these bodybuilders who are making improvements every year and they compete every year. Layne, you say you need to take time off. Well, how are they able to? Well, drugs. And
Yeah,
no disrespect. I don't, what somebody chooses to put in their body is their decision. But you just have to understand that if you are a drug-free athlete and you want to make progress, it is not reasonable to expect that you're going to be able to compete every single year. Bill, I'm interested in your opinion on this.
Yeah, with my limited coaching experience, I don't have many rules, but one of the rules is you may not compare yourself to somebody else, or if you're going to, I can't ever hear about it. Comparing yourself,
yeah,
all day long, we can set goals, and then we can reassess our goals. And this is where just the social media aspect. There's so
yeah,
much fakeness on what we choose to look at. So just as a general coaching philosophy, if you're looking at anybody else, now again, looking at other people for motivation is one thing, but looking at other people, engaging your progress against theirs, that's a recipe for disaster,
yeah,
anxiety, depression, um, and just not being the best version of yourself. So again, I don't have many rules, but we're never going to compare somebody else's progress, because you can always find somebody
yeah.
that's going to make you look inferior when and the sad part of that is it may not even be real what you're looking at. And in fact, it's many times it's probably not real.
Exactly. And it's just an endless loop and cycle. And the reality is, you will never be able to look like somebody else. Like, no matter what, if you follow exactly what they do the exact same drugs as they do, whatever it may be, you won't look exactly like them. And I think, especially going into the sport so young, and, I started off on that same boat where I would see other competitors and I'm like, why am I not like that? I'm doing all of this work. That's the moment when I was, and I saw that level of maturity as an athlete. And I know being a coach definitely helped me reason with that, is understanding that this is my progress, my goals, my body, and I can never look like anybody else. And especially when it comes to competing, it's very easy for competitors to compare to fellow competitors, that they will step on stage. You are not the person to be judging. Leave that to the judges. My rule of thumb, especially around show day, I just don't follow or like mute them, so I don't see anything until I step that stage. And once I'm off that stage, I follow everybody back and I'm like, what's up, everyone? Congratulations. Great show. You did amazing. There's no reason to infiltrate your mind to like mess with your head as an athlete. And I see that with like some of my competitive athletes. Rule of thumb for me, my rule of, like, don't you dare look at who's stepping stage with you. It doesn't matter, because you're not gonna, you looking and feeling like shit after is not gonna change the way they look. It's probably gonna mess with your own head and your own performance. So we talked about performing enhancing drugs, but let's dive into talking about just supplements and vitamins or things like that that you would recommend for a competition prep and for a build. So what would be your top recommendation, both of you, for a build and an actual comp prep?
Go ahead, Bill. Let you take this one
I'll
first.
start, Layne, then you can jump in. One, I would start with the philosophy we don't want to rely on any supplement. So
Yeah.
theoretically, we're gonna handle this with our training and nutrition,
Yep.
and supplements will be. And again, this is coming from a supplement researcher,
Yeah.
so I like supplements. Don't get me wrong, but I'm never gonna look at that as this is foundational to your success.
Yeah.
So I always start there, and again, I firmly believe that.
Yeah.
The absolute essentials in this physique world is creatine monohydrate.
Yep.
And you'd be amazed based on some surveys. Now, this isn't published yet, but I'm aware of a bodybuilding survey, and we're doing one in my lab, so I'm not referring to that one. We don't have data yet. How many bodybuilders don't take creatine? That's insane to me. It works. It's one of the few supplements that is overwhelmingly effective and safe and inexpensive. So that blows my mind. So creatine is an absolutely must. It builds muscle. Again, we have non-responders.
Yeah.
But in a physique sport, this is the one supplement that we know builds muscle mass. And it builds the actin and myosin proteins. And there's research to suggest it increases the myonuclear domain aspect of muscle hypertrophy. So it's multi-mechanistic in terms of how it improves muscle mass. So creatine would be one absolutely essential. I also would suggest just a general multivitamin, multimineral as kind of what I call an insurance policy. Some people, and we write about this in our course, vitamin D is a lot of people are deficient and they don't know it. And a lot of that evidence is also correlational. So it's tough. Like if you're deficient, we get clear benefits. If you're not, I don't think supplementing with it's going to make a big difference. Yeah. But I was surprised as I did the research. There's a lot of people that are either deficient, clinically deficient, even if they live in sunny areas, or they are not sufficient in their vitamin D intakes. Yeah. So those people, there's a clear benefit. For others, probably not as much with supplementation. So those would be the two in a building phase that I think that would just be a staple of your program. And then another one with limited evidence is fish oil or EPA, DHA. We also talked about that one. Is that going to change your physique? Some of the early research said yes. Like the earlier research on this, which was really interesting. Noreen from Gettysburg, they gave it to sedentary people. They gained muscle, they lost fat without exercise. It was literally like exercise in a bottle. And then over the years, the research has not replicated that. So I'm not as optimistic on that for physique changing. Yeah. But we have joint health with that. We have better brain function with it. So it's one of those supplements that I think makes sense for people to supplement with. But creatines would be at the top of my list during muscle building, and at least a check on your vitamin D levels to make sure, because we do have pretty robust data associating vitamin D and strength. Layne, what would you add to the muscle building list?
I mean, I think you covered the important points. Like whey protein, it's not any necessarily more anabolic than other proteins, but in terms of a supplement, it has been shown to increase lean mass. Is it better than other high quality proteins? Probably not for muscle building in the long run. There are some other supplements that I consider useful. But for the most part, and I would say this too, kind of like training, what works for off season is going to work for in season too. The only thing I could add to that might be a little more caffeine during the contest prep phase, just from the perspective of making up for being a little bit in an energy deficit and not feeling as good, and then also maybe like an appetite suppressant, that sort of thing. But for the most part, I think they're pretty similar. And, Bill hit the nail on the head creatine monohydrate, cheap, effective, inexpensive, or cheap, effective, safe. I don't know what else you
Yeah.
could ask for. I mean, it's literally, I would never tell somebody you need creatine monohydrate, but if your goal is to be muscular with less body fat, I cannot think of any reason why you would not be taking it. And like Bill said,
Yeah.
it blows my mind that this is like this
Yeah.
is like uh, this is like free money. Like the best way to describe it, I guess.
It's
And
go ahead.
on an acute level, citrulline malate or citrulline, if you're trying to maximize each resistance training session,
Yeah.
I can make a strong argument for that. The research is actually very favorable on citrulline and citrulline malate. Long term, again, that goes back to the quality of your training sessions.
Yeah.
But yeah, caffeine is
Yeah.
it's actually tailor made for fat loss, in my opinion, in terms of its safety. Now, again, you can overdose, and there would be some severe consequences. But within normal recommended dosages,
Yeah.
there's not much that it doesn't offer.
Exactly. And one of the questions we got from one of our viewers is, would you say magnesium might be something to address for those with a vitamin D deficiency, or is that not a main causing factor for vitamin D deficiency?
Yeah, I that it does make sense to take magnesium with vitamin D in a deficiency. I think it helps with the absorption. I think that's what I remember reading on that. And again, remember, a lot of people that would never otherwise think they're deficient or not getting sufficient levels, they actually are. So it's I got my levels tested and I was barely above, and I live in Florida.
Yeah.
I was barely above the sufficient level. So I live that myself.
Yeah. So would you got to follow up to that? Would you recommend to coaches, or let me rephrase, what would you recommend for coaches when an athlete is coming to start a competition prep? Some sort of like screening, blood test, things like that. Do you recommend that, or do you base it off of more surface level biofeedback like physical appearance, measurements, weight, things like that? Would you ever dive into looking at that data as well? Do you recommend it for coaches to help them, tailor things for their athletes?
So I think usually the way I approach this is I'll use the anthropometric stuff, weight, body fat, their current nutrition information. If they've got any of that extra stuff, great. I don't tell people they need to do it unless we start getting into things and it looks like something weird is going on or we're not having some of the progress that we might be expecting. Then I might have them pull blood work and whatnot.
Yeah.
I think it's great if they can do it. Absolutely, I encourage it. I think it should be something you get done just as a human being, once a year at least. But
Yeah.
I don't like tell people they have to do it just because it is a little bit difficult for some people with their schedules or, their health insurance. Although hopefully you would have health insurance before you're hiring a physique coach,
Yeah.
and those sorts of things. But some people don't have the same priorities. But I think that if that's the case, what I always tell people is I'll have people say, well, I did this test and this person like pinched my subscap and they said it means I'm estrogen dominant. And I'm like, well, you realize you can like literally just go get your estrogen measured, right? Like it's not difficult.
Yeah.
We don't need a surrogate measure for this. We can actually measure the exact thing you're wanting to measure.
Exactly.
And I find that to be the case too. People say, well, my hormones are out of whack. And usually I'll say, well, which ones? And they usually
All of
don't.
them.
They usually don't have a reply after that. But if they say, "Well, my thyroid's low," okay. Well, have you had it measured? No. Okay. Well, how do you know it's low? Well, I just have trouble losing fat. Okay. Well, there could be many other explanations for that. So, what I
Oh
would
yeah.
tell people is, if you think you've got something that's out of whack, or you think something might be wrong, absolutely get it measured. But I think some people don't want to get things measured because then if it wasn't out of whack, they wouldn't have that excuse anymore. So
Yeah.
don't
Well,
kill
I
me,
think
people
in
in the chat.
general, clients tend to give excuses of why they're falling short with their efforts. And, if they're falling short with their efforts and not reaching their goals, they will make excuses for those things. I was guilty of doing that when I was younger myself. I would just say something. I used to say something ridiculous like that. My doctor told me my hormones are off. That's why I can't. It was just simply my relationship with food that was distorted. And yeah, and I see that, with my younger clients as well, and even my older clients, where their doctor tells them something and they hang on to it and say, yep, this is the reason why I can't achieve this. I have been diagnosed with PCOS, endometriosis, something like this, and then that's the reason I can't do it. And they become that identity, and that's it. That they just can't reach that goal. So I think as a coach, it's important that if they are saying things like that, to stay up to date with like actual measures for it, but also encouraging that, being real with, yeah, some things can make it harder for you, and we might have to put in a little bit more work and effort, but that you're not stuck in the position that you're in. We can work on ways on improving. You might not get that end goal right away, but it's not like, oh, this is the end. You are this diagnosis, right? Um,
And I want to just add a little bit to the
yeah,
contest prep aspect of supplementation.
yeah,
And notice that neither Layne or I are prepared to talk for an hour and a half about supplements like many people would.
yeah,
And Layne, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you even sell supplements and they are effective, but just noticed by our willingness to go back to the training, go back to the nutrition. That's the foundation, the bedrock of the correct mindset.
yep,
But caffeine, I do want to go back to caffeine because in our course, we did what would be considered a monumental deep dive on caffeine. And I'd like to get Layne and your feedback on this, Maria. My approach would be as soon as you're ready for contest prep, don't throw everything into your fat loss basket as possible. Don't start doing cardio 6 days per week. Don't reduce your don't go into your caloric deficit. Let's throw caffeine into that. I like once your body starts to adjust to the first stimulus of fat loss,
yep,
now let's give it another one, and now let homeostasis take its time with that. So for caffeine, personally, I like bringing that in after a few weeks, after a period of time. There's a slight appetite suppressant effect with caffeine. It's not strong, but the evidence points in that direction. So that's huge.
yeah,
One, it increases energy expenditure. And the really interesting thing, not only does it burn more calories, it's also a nutrient partitioning agent such that those additional calories that are being burned are coming from body fat. So
yeah,
you actually are, and it's not just breaking down the fat, it's oxidizing it. And what that means is over time you will be losing fat. So
yeah,
again, I don't want to I don't want to say caffeine is like a miracle drug or a miracle supplement.
yeah,
But when I look at what physique athletes desire, and then I look at what caffeine delivers,
yeah,
it's a great fit. And again, that's not to say that you rely on caffeine. No, it is a great supplement
yeah,
to your contest prep. And I would also say if you don't need it, don't take it.
yeah,
It's there you can get just as it's not going to help you get leaner necessarily, but it does seem to help people that are stalling.
yep,
Another huge benefit, it lowers the perception of exercise, the effort. So if you're just dragging through your workouts, well, you know what caffeine does? It makes that workout not seem as bad.
yeah,
And something else that surprised me over the years, there's not a habituation effect that everybody seems to want to say, oh, I'm habituated to caffeine. At least it doesn't exist in the world of metabolic enhancement. So it will increase your metabolic rate, regardless if you're a habitual caffeine user or not. There's no there's no feedback loop to suppress the metabolic activation of caffeine's effects. Maybe psychologically, maybe in those other areas that I haven't done a deep dive on, but
yeah,
so caffeine would be probably just like creatine's at the top of my list for muscle building, although I wouldn't stop taking it for contest prep. Caffeine would be at the top of my list for those who need it
yeah.
during contest prep.
I tend to, as a competitor and as a coach, and every day of the year, I prioritize sleep as my number one. But again, when it comes to training and during my preps, especially as I get closer, I want to make sure that I'm performing my best. And sometimes that energy isn't going to be coming from nutrition, especially when the calories are quite starting to take a dent. So, I make sure that I'm not like downing 600 milligrams of caffeine, right? But I start small and I use it around my training, and that little extra just boost of energy to really ensure that you're pushing with the proper intensity instead of, like you said, dragging your feet or half-assing your training sessions, maximizing that output, even if there is that like little dip of energy afterwards. So, it's not the miracle. And I always encourage even my clients, like, don't become dependent on it to the point where your sleep is starting to be jeopardized. That always is that balance of with everything. Too much of anything is a bad thing. So, one more thing about supplements before we dive into talking about a little bit more about nutrition and then peak weeks, because that's super important. One of our listeners asked about, how no one ever really addresses consistently testing high levels of vitamin D. Is there anything that should be changed in that situation in regards to like your protocols as a coach for a client?
So,
So
so let me just repeat the question
Yeah,
so I understand before I would answer. So nobody ever talks about testing for high levels of vitamin D.
yeah. What can be changed in that, or what should be changed in that situation?
So if somebody's high, and there's different organizations that will give a what they would deem as too high of a level. The
Yeah,
Institute of Medicine would say anything over 50. I can't remember. I guess it's international units or whatever the. Forgive me if I don't remember the actual blood values, and it's 25 OH in the blood. The Endocrine Society would say I think that they have a much higher threshold, over 100.
yeah,
But if you get tested and it's high, and you're currently taking a vitamin D supplement,
yeah,
then you just stop. You stop taking the supplement,
yeah,
or you back off. So I did that with my wife. She was a little low. We increased her, giving her a large amount of vitamin D. Her levels got high, I think in the low 80s. And again, depending on the organization, that could be considered high. Some people would call that adequate.
yeah,
Um, where I have come to, and I think Layne agrees with me, if you get your blood levels approximately between 40 to 50, that seems to be you're getting all of the physiological benefits. You're avoiding any organization's level of a toxic or too high of a dosage. So 40 to 50 um, would be a level that I aspire to. And again, that's all in our course. We talk about the research. We talk about how you can predict what your levels will be based on a daily supplementation strategy. But so, real quick, just to summarize, if your levels are too high, and again, you and your physician are going to have to make that determination because there is no consensus
yeah,
on what's too high.
yeah,
You would just simply reduce your supplementation.
yeah,
That will guaranteed will lower your levels if you reduce your supplementation.
yeah. I
yeah,
hope that answers your question. Whoever asked that, go ahead, Layne.
I would just say that I feel pretty confident in saying the only way you're going to get to those levels is probably through supplementation. It's very hard to achieve those kinds of levels of vitamin D without supplementation.
Yeah.
Yeah, unless you're living in Florida and you're in a nudist colony and you're outside 24 hours a day. I mean,
Then maybe carrying an umbrella to minimize your actual sun exposure, right? We're going to dive into talking now about the real fun stuff, not so fun stuff for some competitors sometimes, going into full blown peak week, nutrition, and then talking about post show, which I think, in my opinion, is really crucial. So, peak week. Why do some athletes carb load right before show day? And what is the best nutrition approach to take with clients from about week 2 to show day? How do you guys navigate that? Your general recommendations.
So, carb loading, the idea of carb loading, I think the protocols that are out there, a lot of those came about from what endurance athletes do. I think it was kind of dogma carried over from that. Now, that being said, it does appear you can kind of super compensate your glycogen. And so the idea is if you deplete it and then compensate by increasing, carbohydrate intake, that you can actually, for a short period of time, increase your levels of glycogen. What I will say is the appearance on stage, yes, having high levels of glycogen help, but it's not just a glycogen thing. There's a lot of things that play into it. In fact, I would argue that fats on show day are also important because they, if you've ever looked at blood that is after somebody who's had a high fat meal, it's like cloudy, and that increase in dietary fat in the bloodstream is going to actually help expand the blood vessels and hopefully improve vascularity. And so I think, yes, carbohydrate can help. Yes, it's important to make sure you're getting adequate amount of carbohydrate before show. But I think the way in which people carb load is pretty risky, to be honest, which is usually like very, very, very aggressive carb depletion followed by very, very aggressive carb loading. And when you're doing that in the few days before the show, you don't really give yourself a lot of wiggle room if you overshoot. So my feeling is I'd rather have somebody be a little bit flat, slightly flat, but very, very tight than spilled over and softer, but very, very full. So
How do you prevent that from happening?
So I tend to err on the side of caution with that. So a lot of it's just not making huge, crazy changes. I'm not a big fan of these massive swings in anything, to be quite frank. I do make modifications to sodium, carbohydrate, fats during peak week, fiber, but they're not enormous changes. And I think that here's the thing, if you are really, really lean, like all this stuff is like 2%. And what I see people doing is either sacrificing 20% to get 2% to try to get 2%, or they're simply just not ready and they're trying to wing this sort of peak week magic to make up for it. And also, it also enables them to have a nice excuse to where, well, if they just weren't lean enough, they say, well, I just mistimed my peak week. I mistimed my carb load. No, you mistimed it by about 6 weeks is what you did.
Yes.
So getting lean enough and muscular enough is 98% of the equation. Yes, you can make some subtle adjustments and changes to the way your physique appears. But you can do that with minimal risk. One of the things I do is I actually tend to have people carb up a little bit earlier in the week. And when I say carb up, I mean I'm talking about, if they've been consuming 200 grams of carbohydrate on average per day during prep, I might put them up to 400 or 500 for a couple of days.
Yeah.
Oh, pardon me. Oh.
No worries.
I didn't sleep very well last night. I was so excited for this masterclass. So once I'll do that a little bit earlier in the week when they're still training pretty hard, and then I'll bring them down. A lot of people say, well, why would you do that? Well, if you have saturated muscle glycogen, it's not like that glycogen is just going to like randomly disappear if you're not training. Like most people, as the show approaches, they taper their training volume down because you don't want to be sore on show day. So that glycogen isn't going to necessarily go anywhere. And the nice thing about doing a little bit more carbohydrate a little bit earlier in the week is if you miss and you do too much, you have 2-3 days to make adjustment and tighten back down. Or if you didn't load enough, cool, you've still got a few more days to push more in. So it just, to me, it gives a little bit more option, and it doesn't require the same kind of like bullseye as an aggressive load a few days before a show. And I will say, that's just a general recommendation. I have had clients who respond extremely well to a pretty aggressive carb load the day or two before a competition. So I'm not a one-size-fits-all kind of guy. But in general, I tend to like to do the earlier in the week carb load just because there's less chance for screw-ups.
And is there a carb source that you recommend?
So early in the week, it can kind of be whatever you want. In terms of like, you should probably still keep like the same sources in that you'd had previously. When you get to about 24 hours out, or about 18 hours out at least, I have people really reduce their fiber intake. Fiber is great for overall health. It is great for
Yeah,
contest prep because it's filling. But fiber works by drawing water into your GI,
yeah.
which is what adds bulk to your stool. Actually, I'm sorry, my cat's gonna join me now. Um, and so, say hi to the people, Kay. Hi. So that's what you don't want on show day. So while it's great for for contest prep to feel full, on contest prep you want to be full glycogen wise, but you don't want to feel full in your GI. So I will
No.
usually drastically reduce and use what's called low residue sources of carbohydrate. And if you just look up low residue diet, you can find what these sources are. But traditional things like rice cakes, things that are low in fiber, easy to digest, that sort of thing. You're just going to hog all the attention, aren't you? But other than that, I think keeping the similar sources throughout the week is perfectly fine.
Oh,
They did ask about non-nutritive sweeteners. What I'll
Yes,
say
I was
is,
just, you have a question on that too, talking about the artificial sweeteners, and then Bill, your comment too.
yeah. So I would say, non-nutritive sweeteners sometimes can also include things like erythritol, which can cause people some GI distress. It kind of depends on the artificial sweetener, but for the most part, like things like sucralose and aspartame are relatively safe things because the amount that's needed to sweeten things is so low because they are so sweet. So aspartame is 200 times sweeter than sugar.
Yeah,
Sucralose is 600 times sweeter than sugar. So the amount you need is so low that it's just likely not going to cause any kind of GI distress. But if you know that it causes GI distress or you feel like it may cause GI distress for you, then it's fine to omit that. But for most people, I don't think they need to.
yeah. Bill,
I
you're,
was just gonna discuss people who have done multiple shows or are more advanced than coaches. They probably know exactly why you would do carb loading. So I just want to just for anybody that's new, the thinking is the philosophy is you resistance train to build bigger muscles.
yeah,
Carbs, when you eat them, you only store them in two places. Your body does not do a good job of storing carbs. So your muscles will store carbs and your liver will store carbs. Your liver only stores about 100 grams. It's not a lot. All the rest of the carbs go to your muscles and they can be stored there. The
yeah,
interesting thing about that is when you store carbs in muscle, we call it glycogen, muscle glycogen, it actually draws in water. So there's like 3 grams of water for every gram of glycogen that you
yeah,
store. So the reason, the philosophy of carb loading is to fill out the muscle with glycogen and water to give it a more full appearance.
yeah,
So there's the rationale. And one thing that Layne said that this science came from sports nutrition, the endurance literature. And one thing, the way that science has progressed was initially they did all of their glycogen loading with a big depletion workout. So long endurance or like resistance training in this case, just many sets of many reps, totally deplete the glycogen in there.
yeah,
And then you went and force fed yourself a bunch of carbs because the thinking was, well, now the muscle's craving carbs. You have the protein transporter that will bring in carbs is called GLUT4, so that becomes very active. But as that science progressed, what they realized was you don't need to really disrupt your training and have these massive depletion workouts. It can be minor depletion, and very interestingly, even if you just increase carbs, nothing else, you don't do anything with your training, you can actually almost double your muscle glycogen content. And something that Layne said, I think Layne actually taught me this. If you do your job as a coach, and your athlete is lean going into the show, you can actually use the 2 or 3 weeks going into the show as an experiment of let's carb load early in the week. How are we looking the week before the show? So
Yep.
and I love that approach. That way you're not doing anything for the first time on the week of the show. You actually can have like some trial runs.
Yeah. And it's also as a, an athlete complying with what the coach is saying. Again, that came with maturity of going through a few shows and understanding all of these concepts as a coach as well. The past 3 shows, I have been quote unquote ready about 2, 3 weeks before, and we were able to, try refeed, see how my body responds. Oh, this is great. So then we know what we're going to use on peak week. And, my rule of thumb is, and it just brings so much peace and low cortisol, knowing that you don't have to stress the last week of show to get ready. You're cruising in. And that's one thing I'm endlessly grateful for, because right now I'm in my peak week. The only thing I'm really trying to do is like relax, keep outside stress down. But when it comes to my training is tapered, my cardio, no, I'm just literally cruising in. And that as an athlete also feels so good, because you go in so confident knowing that, the work is kind of technically done by now, right? There's still little things we're doing, but it gives low stress. And stress is the last thing we need during that week. Don't be that coach that's like, at this hour, you got to do this. And then at this hour, because that is so stressful. And I did that once and I was just like, oh my God, it's 11:30, not 11. That's it. I'm overspilling. I'm doing something. It was the worst experience I've ever had. So now I'm really grateful for my coach for allowing me to cruise in and knowing that I don't need to do that. And as long as I'm chilled and relaxed, my body is doing what it's doing. The work is already done. So you guys have touched on that before too. You don't need all those crazy protocols from like, OG bodybuilding days, right?
Yeah, and I think the coaches that do that are trying to aspire to some type of guru status and
Yeah.
patented peak week strategies that only I do.
Yeah.
And here's a simple test. Ask your coach, why are we doing this?
Always ask questions. Always, always.
And just see what answer you would get.
Yeah.
I would be surprised if they would have an answer to why they're doing something in a lot of the situations.
Yeah. You
Yeah,
guys touched on. Oh, go ahead, Layne.
well, they'll usually answer with something. Well, this is going to dry you out, or this is how, how. That's always go down the rabbit hole. How
Yeah.
So Maria, I want to touch on something really quick because you brought up a really great point, and that is stress. And one of the reasons I'm all for people experimenting and whatnot, but I will say, like, it's very difficult to replicate the stress on show day, and that's such a novel
Yeah.
difference. So
Yeah.
a lot of times I tell my clients this, you may, like, the best you look during prep may not be on the stage, and that could be even if you do everything right, because
Yeah.
you're not in control on show day. The schedule is going to go, well, it could run 3 hours late. You
Yep.
could have had to, I don't know, maybe your car breaks down and you got to walk to the thing. Who knows, right? There could be
Yep.
untold number of things that happen. But again, in general, the athletes who I've always seen look their best relatively were people who let go of the things they could not control. If things happened that were outside their control, that were stressful, like the show's running late, we would reframe it as, well, this is actually an advantage for you because you're in great shape. So all these
Yeah.
other people, let's let them stress about it because it's not going to affect you.
Yeah.
So this is actually an advantage for you, right?
Yeah.
Those people have always done well. And you make a great point that, if you're doing all this micromanaging, that is going to, like, especially for people who tend to have a more neurotic style mindset,
Yeah.
if that is more likely to really stress them out, to feel like
Yep.
they've got to hit all that stuff perfect, and the reality is, like, whether you had your rice cake now or 15 minutes ago, it's not
Yeah.
going to change the outcome on the stage.
Yeah, and just one more to add, as Bill said this before, mindset wise, don't compare. At that week on that show day, there's no more control for you to change things. You look the way you look. You won't build any muscle on that day. You can't get any leaner at that moment. You just have to truly step into that confidence that, and one of the things that I do and I encourage is if you give your best effort during prep, you don't leave anything in the tank. You are as compliant as you can be executing things from the week one until peak week. Then you can step on that stage knowing you confidently tried everything you could. And now it's on the judges, and they can completely flip a coin and pick someone you don't even know that's actually going to be there. Right. So that's one of the things that, my coach helped me develop and I try to help develop with my girls is that day you have to really have like the blinders on where it's like it's you versus you. And as cheesy as that sounds, it truly helps with the mindset because if you're backstage, you see everybody's nervous, everybody's like looking at everybody. It's already done. The work is done. That's the best day to have a good time, have fun. You're doing this for a big reason, right? And that's the day that should be the least stressful. You touched on sodium, Layne, and that's one of our questions that we have in terms of salt and water manipulation. So to come in drier, what is that about? Why is that used? Do you recommend it? And talk to us a little bit more about that.
Absolute and utter dogma garbage. So this is, I'm guessing that this came about dogmatically from either wrestling, because wrestlers would tend to be lean,
Yeah.
and they would cut water to cut weight. And so since they did that, I guess bodybuilders just figured, well, I guess we'll do that. Or it could be that they don't understand that your body has different compartments of water, and one of those compartments of water is inside the cell. And the
Yeah.
water inside the cell is actually a greater amount than the water outside your cells. And oh, by the way, your muscle tissue is about 30% actual fibrous tissue and 70%, you guessed it, water. So, and the number of times I hear the following phrase: I looked so great a week out. Well, I looked so great the day after the show. I don't know what happened. Well, I'll tell you what happened. After the show, you went out and stopped worrying about drinking water and eating sodium, and that's
Yeah.
why you looked good.
Yeah.
So people, it's so funny. I'll hear people, oh, I looked so much better the day after the show. I just didn't carb load hard enough. When in reality, they were carb loading, like 500 grams of carbs a day for 3 days. And no, it wasn't the carbs. It was you finally stopped worrying about water and sodium. So if we actually look at the literature, I think the other place this dogma came from, this is the bro scientists. They opened up the basic biology book, and were like, ooh, this sodium potassium pump, it pumps sodium out and it pumps potassium into the cell. Therefore, we should just load potassium and eliminate sodium. That has absolutely nothing to do with with the actual fluid balance. First off, if you reduce sodium, say goodbye to your vascularity.
Yeah.
If you ask people who cut sodium out of their diet, you'll hear this all the time. I couldn't get a pump on show day. No matter what I did, I couldn't seem to get a pump. Sodium is one of the best osmolytes there is. If you've ever been lean and gone out and had a really salty meal, you will be extremely vascular 2 hours later. So we actually use that to our advantage on show day. So I'll actually increase sodium about 2 hours out. But the other thing is your glucose transporter in your intestinal lumen is actually sodium dependent, and they've shown that a low sodium diet can decrease the activity of that transporter. So now, what are these people doing who are cutting sodium? The days leading up to a show, they're also loading carbohydrate. Oh, by the way, now you've got carbohydrate that isn't getting transported across the intestinal lumen as quickly as usual, which could lead to glucose being retained in the intestinal lumen, which will pull water into your intestine, which is where you don't want it, which will make you feel bloated. And so there's just all these problems. And also, by the way, if you get your sodium to potassium ratio too out of whack, it'll actually cause you to retain water through reabsorption in the distal tubule. So
Yeah.
You don't need to do these sorts of things. And the other thing is to keep in mind, like taking a diuretic, cutting water, all that is doing, and there's actually a study on this now. All that does is decrease your total body water. It does not
Yeah.
change the ratio of extracellular water to intracellular water. And I think those people just must have never taken basic chemistry or just didn't pay attention in basic chemistry, because there's a principle called Le Chatelier's principle that if they understood it, they would understand why cutting water or taking a diuretic is not going to make a difference in your ratio of extracellular to intracellular water.
I will say and comment that on my first show, I had to make all of these mistakes myself by the guidance that I had. And I actually cramped on stage really freaking bad. My calf just locked up on me and I worked it through. But the minute I stepped off the stage, both of my calves went Charlie horse on me. I had a shaker bottle of salt backstage. This is fun story of like trying to get salt because I'm like, my legs will not stop cramping and I'm chugging water. Never again, ladies and gentlemen. I learned from my mistakes, and this is why you ask your coaches why you're doing what you're doing, even if you were a complete noob like I was. It was terrible. It
All
was
that I could think
terrible.
about when you said that was the Salt Shaker song by Yang Yang Twins. Sorry.
One of the things we'll talk real quick about post show, but one more question about peak week
Yeah.
is the reducing inflammation. So the tapering of training, or what are ways that you can reduce that inflamed look that people always say that my body's inflamed or you're swollen in your legs and you want to have more definition on show day. How do you navigate that when it comes to like training or nutrition?
Yeah, so I think some people take this way too far and they don't train for like 5 days before a show and all that kind of stuff. I think that's a bad idea. Just don't do anything outside the norm. Don't do forced reps. Don't do drop sets. Don't train to
Yeah,
failure. Maybe avoid some of the big compound lifts in the 72 hours before the show.
yeah,
But you can still train pretty hard. Like, just in general, I recommend people, go 80% of what you usually do.
yeah,
Like in terms of your weights or your reps, just do 80% of normal. And if you
yeah,
do that, you're not going to be overly sore, but you're going to retain some of the fluid where it should be,
yeah,
and you're going to expend some energy and that sort of thing. So I think that I tend to use the 80% rule. Now there's no research studies on this kind of stuff, but
yeah,
usually in order to get the kind of muscle damage evoked that's required to initiate some of those that inflammatory response, it usually requires a kind of a semi-novel stimulus.
yeah,
So if you're not just doing anything crazy on show day, but again, like some of these people, they do like these crazy depletion workouts. Well,
yeah,
that's a novel stimulus that might make you sore. Like that's not a good
yeah.
idea.
Yeah. I just personally, I'm very bad at knowing how to do that. I like to push because I love to lift heavy. And I'm like, all right, PR, peak week. So my coach is like, well, Monday or Tuesday has to be your last leg day because you are crazy with that and you don't know how to stop. It's just up to your athlete. But yeah, in terms of like, don't think that peak week is the magic week where you have to like train like you've never trained before because you can think you could build as much muscle as you can because you realize you want more glutes. But let's be clear about that, right? There's very small actual changes you can make that week. Just fine tuning your ready physique. Now, before I don't want us to run out of time, but I do want to touch on post show, talking about navigating your first, 4 weeks post show. What are your recommendations as a coach for navigating that with an athlete? In my opinion, I always say prep doesn't end until maybe 4 to 8 weeks after show. So though this is my last week, I have about a month or two left of still being on top of my game. But what are your guys' recommendations on that?
Uh, Before Layne jumps in on that, I just want to say that's a very important question.
Yeah,
And um, one of Layne's coaches, James Longstrom, he did a case series study on this. And if you don't have a plan, and Layne's going to share with us how he approaches this, but some of the newer competitors in this case series study, in the 4 weeks after their show, it was a very sad outcome. I'm talking a near 30-pound weight gain in an otherwise petite female.
Yeah.
And what we also noticed was the experienced competitors seemed to navigate that beautifully. So
Yeah.
there was an experience factor here, which I'm sure also comes along with coaching and getting good guidance. So I just wanted to say, if you don't get this right, and this particular client was dealing with a little bit of depression around this issue, or not client, this was a subject. So just wanted to preface it with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great point, Bill. I think again, there's very little research on this sort of stuff. What we do know is people can regain body fat very rapidly post show. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to restore. You're gonna have to, if you're very lean, you're gonna have to regain some body fat. Like there's no question about it. Like you can't stay in that completely depleted state. I actually, so I've come around on this. I used to kind of reverse diet a lot of people very slowly out of a show. And I thought it was cool because they stayed lean and they were adding calories, and then turned to find out that they still felt like crap, even though some of them got their calories up very high. Because when you're that lean, you are going to feel like crap regardless. Now, obviously, if they have another show coming up in like a month or something like that, it doesn't make sense to regain a bunch of body fat, or even a modest amount of body fat. But if we're assuming that this person is going into a longer off season of, let's say, at least, 6, hopefully more than that, months, there's going to have to be some regain of body fat.
Yeah.
And so actually what I started doing, and I found that people responded well to, was when I tried to do it conservatively, people tended, especially competitors who are so depleted, they just couldn't adhere to a really conservative approach. So what I usually do is I actually start off the reverse diet for a competitor a little bit more aggressive. So, allow them to gain some body fat back, and an amount of calories that they can actually hit, right? Like if I'm like, okay, we're going to start right at your maintenance right now, what it is right now. And that person, and you have to understand, if you've ever competed, you are famished. Like food is all you can think about. It controls your every thought. You are a bottomless pit. And so if you're trying to like just modestly increase calories, it's going to be really difficult for that person to adhere to it. So what I tend to do now is say, okay, in this first month, let's try to, increase body weight by probably around 2%, 2 or 3%. And then, this is just a general amount. So don't take me too. These aren't hard numbers. I just don't want people to be dogmatic about it, right? But let's say somebody was, 80 kilos on stage. I'd really like to see them up to around 82 kilos, 83 kilos, by the end of the month. And then once they've gotten a little bit of body fat on, they start feeling a little bit better. Their energy starts coming back, their libido starts coming back. Then we can back it off a little bit, slow it down, and start a more conservative reverse. And this is different. I want people to understand, the coaches out there, if it's somebody who just finished a fat loss phase and they're not at a super low body fat, then you can conservatively reverse diet them, and I think that's completely appropriate. But if it's somebody heading into an off season who's at a very low body fat, it is no reason to keep them there for a longer period of time, and that's something I've changed my mind on.
I've done both, where I was, again, going back to my very first one where I made a lot of my mistakes, is I said, screw it. And although I had a quote unquote plan, I kind of was like, I haven't seen food before. And just because my approach was also really not as sustainable to begin with, I ended up gaining about like 20 to 25 pounds within the first 4 to 5 weeks, which for me during that, it was a lot. It was a lot mentally, physically. It was just a lot to deal with. And I think since then, I've taken it where it's more conservative, and then, more conservative because of I have a back-to-back show. And I've taken it where it's like I gave myself, like you said, a boundary of, okay, this is what we're going to allow for body fat or weight regain. and you want to stay around there. If we're reaching really close, then maybe starting to be a little bit more accurate. But I personally, for my own mental sanity and what I like to recommend for my clients is, if you're going to be more rigid with a competition prep, whether you're flexible dieting or following your own meal plan or whatever it may be, giving that time where mentally you're kind of just off. Like it's truly, as much as dedication as you have, you need that off time, because you're gonna burn out. And doing those back-to-back shows, the candle wick is like, oh, I can't wait to just build and get strong and eat again. So
Yeah.
I think both approaches it depends on the client and what their next goal is, right? If, let's say, their summer is coming and they don't really feel comfortable to gain an excessive amounts of body fat, maybe being more conservative might be the approach. Just figuring out what their next goal is so that you could tailor it. But having no plan is the worst plan.
Yeah.
Whether it's after a fat loss goal or after a competition prep.
So Maria, if you were my client in that first phase where you were struggling to, really stick to anything, I would have said, well, as a coach, I might have said, okay, what is the minimum amount of calories that you think you could consistently stick to, right?
Yeah.
And if you said, oh, it's 2,500, but I think I could stick to 2,500, but I still be gaining body fat. My thing would be, well, yeah, but probably less than you are now, because if you're really just, you feel so restricted because you're trying to hit this lower amount of calories. One, when you don't hit that, people tend to go into screw it mode and just eat whatever. And two, by being able to hit that, it's going to give you some mental wins, and you're just going to start feeling better. So I think that's really great points. And again, no one size fits all, but in general with competitors, allow yourself initially to gain some body fat, and then kind of once you've gotten 2-3% body fat on, then you can kind of back up and slow down the reverse, or even hit maintenance for a little while if you want to.
Yeah. And, I think one of the biggest things is, again, we're humans and so are our clients. And after a fat loss phase, or especially a competition prep, because that sometimes can require pushing a little bit more aggressively and being more restrictive and rigid, especially if their maintenance is dropping and their deficit is quite low. You're going to have to really deal with that communication and relationship, and understanding that being realistic. If you're going to be more flexible, you have to start getting more comfortable with this rate of change. And again, I'm not going to speak just for females, because I've had friends that are male competitors and they deal with the exact same thing. They might not publicly say it, but we all deal with that. But I will say that, I think we've built heaps of information today, but I do want to hear from both of you. What would you say are maybe your one or two solid takeaway for physique coaches that you would like to share? What are your top 1 to 2 takeaways from whether something we've talked about or something you wish that most physique coaches could hear from both of you?
Go ahead, Bill.
All right, I'll start. Something I learned from a wise man, Dr. Norton, what he taught me when working with clients was the number one skill is listening. So listen to your client. Where are they coming from?
Yeah.
Don't go into it with your game plan. Where are they at? Help listen to what they're saying and start your planning there.
Yeah.
I think that's great. I'll just piggyback off of that. I think what I always tell people is, you've got coaches that, if the client and you are going on a trip and you're taking a car, what you really want is you want your client in the passenger seat. Okay, you don't want them to drive the car, because if you drive the car, you're not going to get to your destination. They're just going to go around in circles, right?
Yeah.
Or they're going to go really, really fast, run out of gas, and then you're going to have to find gas and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, all that jazz.
But you also don't want to stick them in the trunk or the back seat, right? If you're not willing to listen to them and listen to the feedback, you're basically just being a cookie cutter coach, which is garbage. So really, yes, I have kind of my best practices in terms of, okay, I find that this works for the majority of people, but I also understand that not everybody's a majority of people. I mean, when I was coaching my wife, I coached her much differently than I coach a lot of my clients, because she is a very extreme person. So I was not, I tried to do it the way that I used to, that would typically work, and it was like, okay, well, this doesn't seem to be working. Not because that she's like, physiologically somewhat different. What
Yeah.
trips, her adherence algorithm is much different than most people I've ever been around. So, you've got to take it with a different approach to, or you have to at least be flexible enough to have a different approach with every
Yeah.
client. However, I think the established kind of best practices approach that you'll learn in Bill and I's course coming up, is going to get you there with 70% of your clients. And then,
Yeah.
the 30%, you just got to listen and,
Yeah.
and make some adjustments. But our course is going to give you the tool to be able to make those adjustments. So we're super excited for that. I know all of Clean Health's really excited for it.
We are very excited to work on that, announce it, and launch it. And like you said, hopefully this year, if not early next. But we're just, a lot of work is getting put into it, and we know that you guys are going to enjoy that. And big thank you for everyone that tuned in. If you jumped in on a time and you want to watch the full thing, these sessions are recorded, and we are going to edit it, put it together, and upload it to our social media platforms, as well as share it with everyone that registered. If you guys are looking for, even more information, especially in regards to training the physique athlete, we have plenty of resources and courses available on the Clean Health website, like Dr. Layne Norton's Advanced Nutrition for Fat Loss course and Dr. Bill Campbell's Building Your Ultimate Body Guidebook. So we have those two resources and a collaboration resource in the making. We are the center of all evidence-based knowledge for all of our PTs and people who simply want to learn it for themselves. And to add on to that, we're known for providing a lot of free education like our master classes. So if you want to make sure you're in the know for that, make sure you're following us on Instagram, YouTube. We share a lot of free education there as well. And of course, following all of us as we do strive to provide the best education for you guys. The more you know, the better the world grows. Dang, I made that sound really good. Thank you guys so much for listening. Bill, Layne, it's always a pleasure to talk and learn from both of you. I look up to both of you and when it comes to how I am as a coach, and I know a lot of people listening do the same. So I am very grateful to have you on today's masterclass with Clean Health.
Thanks, Maria. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye, you guys.